Hey guys, today I'll show you a science fiction thriller TV series named Warehouse 13, Season 1, Part 2. Spoilers ahead, watch out and take care. The scene shifts to Artie using the force of the artifacts to craft the best replica of a samurai sword in history. The original sword belonged to the Japanese emperor during the Tokugawa shogunate and had been unearthed in Okinawa just weeks ago. It was scheduled to be presented as a gift to the U.S. president in Washington later that morning. Artie's task was clear. Before the sword reached the president, he and his team had to steal it from the Japanese embassy and replace it with the replica. As for the sword's special significance, Artie couldn't be bothered to explain. Cut to Washington, D.C., where a man visited a hardware store and purchased 6 peculiar explosives. Not only did he refuse to pay, but he also used a strange weapon to kill the store owner. Meanwhile, Myka and Pete, posing as Secret Service agents, infiltrated the Japanese embassy. On their way in, Myka complained about Artie's secrecy. He should have told them what the samurai sword was capable of since it might be dangerous. Suddenly, a sliver of light appeared from beneath a nearby door, and the two were irresistibly drawn toward it. Pete, disoriented, recalled seeing a Japanese man walk past him before blacking out. Upon waking, he informed Artie that they had been denied entry and treated as suspects. Artie was more concerned about the sword being stolen and unfazed by Pete's account, as neither Myka nor Pete had actually seen the weapon. Pete also mentioned that the explosion was unlike any he had experienced before. It wasn't outward, but inward, as if everything was sucked into a central point. Artie froze, realizing it was an implosion. Myka and Pete asked if it was the sword's doing. Artie quickly dismissed the idea, explaining it was caused by an implosion grenade, which creates a vacuum and violently draws in everything nearby. Artie instructed them to investigate the embassy's interior. After ending the call, a visibly shaken Artie began packing his things. When Lena asked what was wrong, Artie ignored her and rushed out. The two made their way to the Japanese ambassador, only to be met with hostility. The ambassador demanded to know why the Secret Service was sending 2 separate teams. Confused, they noticed a familiar face among the group. It's Daniel, their former superior. Daniel dragged them into his office and berated them for causing trouble under his watch without informing him beforehand. Myka frowned, saying it's a secret mission, so they couldn't tell him. Daniel, furious, said now the Japanese ambassador was questioning him. He told them to get out of here before they caused more trouble. Naturally, they didn't leave. Instead, they sat in their car, secretly surveilling the embassy. Suddenly, Artie appeared, startling them. If he had personally left his hideout, it must have been urgent. He handed them 2 strange pairs of glasses and a bizarre firework, explaining this is a 14th century Chinese firework. Lighting it, a flame burst forth, entrancing everyone who saw it for about 10 minutes. Artie added that it's a kind of illusion, and afterward, no one remembers a thing. Using the firework, the trio entered the epicenter of the earlier implosion and found that everything had been sucked in. Artie confirmed the sword was stolen and revealed details about the implosion grenade. Years ago, he had collected all known grenades of this kind, so their reappearance meant someone had started manufacturing them again. He added ominously that if they knew about the grenades, they might also know about Warehouse 13. Myka and Pete were stunned, asking what else he hadn't told them. If someone like this was running loose, they were in serious danger. Amid the wreckage, they discovered a corpse, further proof that whoever used the implosion grenade was ruthless beyond measure. Artie planned to first identify the person with the implosion grenade and then follow the trail to the sword thief. He pulled out a thick ledger, a comprehensive list of everyone who had ever possessed an implosion grenade. Myka questioned him what exactly was the purpose of the samurai sword. Using such a powerful weapon just to steal a sword suggests that this sword is even more dangerous than the grenade itself. Artie decided to recount the history of the shogunate blade. This legendary weapon had helped the shogunate rule Japan for centuries and allowed the imperial army to dominate the battlefield. Astonishingly, it was entirely handcrafted by hammering together millions of layers of steel, with each blade layer as thin as a single atom. The precise carbon composition of the blade made it impossibly sharp, though Artie didn't elaborate on the specifics. In short, the blade could even slice through light, creating an invisibility effect. Pete, ecstatic, exclaimed that the artifact like this was definitely his. Meanwhile, Myka compared old and new photos of the sword and discovered that the blade wings were missing. The sword and its blade wings formed a complete set, and without them, the sword's power was meaningless. They concluded that whoever stole the samurai sword would undoubtedly target the blade wings next. Artie instructed the two to locate the blade wings while he continued investigating the implosion grenade. Tearing out a page from his ledger, he muttered something about a suspect before leaving. Once he was gone, Pete looked confused, asking how they were supposed to find this. Shrugging, he said their mentor always told them to ask questions when in doubt. So he called Lena, asking her to dig up historical records on anyone who might have owned the shogunate blade. At the same time, Artie revisited the hardware store from the beginning of the mission, finding nothing but a pile of ash, what was left of the store owner. That confirmed the implosion grenade originated from this store. Meanwhile, Myka and Pete used their communicator to report back to Artie, who explained that a Tokyo antique dealer had owned the blade wings in the late 19th and early 20th centuries before donating them to the state. In the 1920s, the Japanese government gifted the wings to Woodrow Wilson as a symbol of peace. Wilson, the 28th President of the United States, had the artifact stored in the Wilson Museum after his death. Just a few days earlier, the museum had planned a ceremony to return the wings and the sword to Japan. But after the explosion at the embassy, the wings had been sent to the Secret Service and ended up with Daniel. Pete and Myka found it suspicious that both the sword and the wings were in Washington at the same time. Pete asked if they should warn Daniel that someone might try to steal the blade wings. Artie stopped him, saying he intended to use Daniel as bait to lure out the thief. As they spoke, Artie noticed something unusual on the ground. Picking up an empty candy wrapper, he hastily left, instructing Pete and Myka to keep following Daniel and find the blade wings. At Daniel's office, the Japanese ambassador barged in and slammed several papers onto the desk. Daniel skimmed through them and cursed under his breath. Artie's wanted notice was among them, accusing him of engaging in suspected espionage. Daniel demanded to know where the notice had come from. The ambassador shrugged, saying it didn't matter. If Daniel didn't handle this properly, he would escalate it to senior officials. He should not blame him if this became an international issue. After the ambassador left, someone entered the office carrying the blade wings. Handing them to Daniel, they explained that the artifact needed to be sent back to the museum. Before they knew it, the blade wings had been transported to the Wilson Museum. From the shadows, Pete and Myka observed everything. Frustrated, Myka muttered that not only was Daniel being used as bait, but so were they. She wondered what if the thief showed up and killed them. Pete tried to reassure her Artie wouldn't let that happen to them. Pete and Myka entered the museum, only to encounter a masked intruder who burst in wielding a Tesla gun. He quickly incapacitated a delivery agent. Pete and Myka revealed themselves, deciding to confront him head-on. The energy blasts from the two Tesla guns collided, sending all three of them sprawling. The masked man used the opportunity to escape, but fortunately he hadn't managed to steal the blade wings. Myka successfully secured them. Just as the two thought the mission was complete, the delivery agent pulled a gun on them. Pete tried to explain the situation, but realizing they had been hit by the Tesla gun, which erased short-term memory, they chose not to resist and surrendered. While they were being interrogated, Daniel arrived to rescue them, tossing Artie's wanted notice at their feet before walking off. He hid the blade wings and increased the security detail guarding them. Artie met with a woman named Carol, who was a former agent of Warehouse 13. Artie asked if Agent James contacted her. Carol shook her head and said no. She added that James, also a former agent working for the warehouse, left because of Artie's relentless and overbearing nature. He was not only cold, but always rubbing salt in people's wounds. Carol cursed the warehouse, muttered a few insults, and left. When Artie returned, he found that Irene had helped herself to Artie's liquor. Artie realized James had come back. Holding up a bag of candies, Artie said, "This is James's favorite treat." Irene accused him that the blade wings were with Daniel and his two subordinates had been detained. He had blinded himself with his own paranoia. She told him to go home and leave the rest to them. Myka, after reading Artie's wanted notice, began to doubt him. But Pete was adamant that Artie was not a bad person. According to the records, Artie once worked for the National Security Agency as a cryptographer in his 20s, specializing in decoding Soviet communications. However, he had secretly contacted individuals under government surveillance and sold intelligence to the Russians. Despite this, he was never prosecuted, and it was as though he vanished from existence. Even his name had been changed. At the same time, Artie attempted to infiltrate Daniel's office alone, trying to steal the blade wings from his safe. He was caught in the act. Even then, Artie pleaded with them to believe him, saying this was dangerous. Pete and Myka confronted him, demanding answers about his alleged espionage. Artie explained he changed his name to avoid detection by the Soviets, not to flee from the government. Those old records were wiped clean with the help of Mrs. Irene, but someone has dug them up again, and their intentions are definitely not good. Suddenly realizing the truth, Artie said the person who gave his files to Daniel must be connected to the theft of the shogunate blade. He concluded it had to be Agent James. Pete and Myka confronted Daniel and were surprised to find the Japanese ambassador there as well. It turned out that the ambassador had provided Artie's file to Daniel and was there to reclaim the blade wings. The Secret Service had even arranged an escort for the ambassador to the airport. Pete suddenly recalled the moment he blacked out earlier. He exclaimed this was the ambassador he saw then. Now the ambassador has both the shogunate blade and the blade wings. Just then, Mrs. Irene sent reinforcements to rescue Artie once more. Meanwhile, Pete and Myka managed to escape and went to find the ambassador. At the same time, Irene admitted to Artie that she was wrong. James has returned. It's up to him now. Artie felt immense pressure. The scene shifted as the ambassador handed over the shogunate blade and the blade wings to a shadowy figure in exchange for some cash. In the next second, the figure vanished into thin air. Artie, armed with a gun, rushed to the airport. He pushed open the door to see the ambassador standing there holding the box. With a sharp sound, the ambassador collapsed to the ground. Shocked, Artie heard another sharp sound and felt his hand get cut, causing him to drop the gun. It was then that Agent James finally revealed himself. James said he felt sorry for Pete and Myka. They've been trapped under his and the warehouse's claws all this time. Hearing this, Artie realized James had done his homework. Artie replied if he dared go near them, he would make him pay in blood. Despite his tough words, it was clear Artie cared for Pete and Myka. Thinking quickly, he grabbed a fire extinguisher and sprayed it in James's face. Without hesitation, James stabbed Artie with a knife. Just then, Artie heard Pete and Myka calling from outside the room. Gathering his strength, Artie pressed the knife further into his own chest to prevent James from retrieving it. Frustrated, James fled. When Pete and Myka arrived, Artie said he knew they too would come. Now he needed to go to the hospital. Before they could move, an implosion grenade rolled out from the shadows. The three immediately bolted. They escaped just in time, or they'd have been flattened like pancakes. Back at the warehouse, Myka was still upset about how indifferent Artie had seemed earlier. She asked if they were just expendable tools to him. Lena explained that Artie had seen too many agents sacrifice themselves or disappear, which caused him to distance himself from others. Myka replied that didn't mean he should bury everything inside. Her voice cracked as she spoke, and she walked off with teary eyes. This created a subtle tension between Pete and Myka, potentially jeopardizing their next mission. Meanwhile, James undoubtedly had more sinister plans in motion. Artie raged in the warehouse, vowing to catch James. Lena quickly calmed his muscles down, telling him to just focus on collecting artifacts with Pete and Myka. Elsewhere, Myka was cataloging artifacts, while Pete played ping-pong against himself. Myka signed that the magic mirror was dangerous, but Pete said playing with it won't hurt. As they argued, Myka tilted her head to the right, a habit she had when she got angry. Still frustrated with Artie, Myka snapped at Pete, who jokingly suggested she think of Artie as a father figure. Myka shoved Pete playfully, but the two nearly knocked over the magic's mirror. Though the mirror didn't break, a nearby disco ball labeled Studio 54 fell from the top shelf, glittering as it hit the ground. Artie entered, shocked to find what they had done. The music stopped, and Myka collapsed to her knees, still reeling from the energetic music. Lena, sensing Myka's unresolved feelings toward Artie, tried to console her with some lighthearted banter. But Myka surprised her, saying she was fine now and she was just going to go with the flow. Lena said she was a sunshine girl. Myka laughed too, and she not only changed her hairstyle, but also completely altered her attitude toward Artie. However, these changes hinted that something was off with Myka. Artie assigned Pete and Myka a new mission involving two gamblers, a man and a woman who never lost through some unknown trick. It was obvious their success wasn't due to luck, but rather the influence of an artifact. Although they always won just enough to avoid suspicion, they hadn't escaped Artie's sharp eye. Myka commented that it was impressive. Artie froze in surprise, unable to believe she was just complimenting him. 3 hours earlier, the gambling pair had been spotted at a hotel in Las Vegas. Naturally, they had to blend in at the casino and gamble a little to keep up appearances. Artie handed Pete and Myka a travel allowance. Pete was surprised to find $10,000. The two quickly set off for Las Vegas. Myka, surprisingly, had put on stunning makeup, wore a particularly seductive outfit, and even sprayed an enticing fragrance. Pete was taken aback, thinking if this was the same tough girl he knew. The two decided to split up, each tailing one of the gambling pair. Back at the warehouse, Artie and Claudia were organizing artifacts when Artie explained the disco ball of Studio 54. He said that thing is essentially a massive physical aphrodisiac. It projects desires and longings into the human psyche through lights and music. It once triggered a devastating riot. While inspecting the magic mirror, the two realized something alarming. Myka's reflection was trapped inside. If Myka was in the mirror, then who was accompanying Pete on the mission? Inside the casino, Pete and the imposter Myka were frantically tracking the gambling pair, who appeared to be a sweet couple. Pete told Myka to stay behind and keep an eye on the pair while he seized the chance to sneak into their room to investigate. Meanwhile, Artie deduced that the explosion of the disco ball had activated the mirror's original reflective abilities, trapping Myka's soul inside and leaving only her residual image. Artie, in frustration, grabbed Lena and told her to touch it, but Lena's hand couldn't penetrate the mirror. Inside the mirror, Myka was speaking, but no one outside could hear her. Claudia suggested they figure out a way to listen to what Myka was saying. Artie immediately shut her down, saying the one in there with her was Bloody Mary, the witch who was undeniably terrifying. If anyone summons her out of the mirror, she'll unleash hell, killing indiscriminately. Still, Artie contacted Pete to check on the situation, carefully avoiding any details that the imposter Myka might overhear through their communication devices. Pete reported everything was fine. Artie, skeptical, wondered if this mirror was just Bloody Mary toying with them. Pete searched the gambling pair's room but found nothing suspicious. Meanwhile, the imposter Myka noticed the gambling man's peculiar habit of rubbing his chips before placing a bet but chose not to inform Pete. Claudia, back at the warehouse, quickly assembled a device that could interpret the vibrations from the mirror, allowing them to hear Myka's voice, similar to playing a record. Artie stopped her again, saying she was losing her mind by talking to Bloody Mary. Claudia reminded him of her brother Joshua, saying the way Myka looks in the mirror now is the same as her brother when he was trapped. She was pretty sure that the real Myka was there. Back at the casino, Pete noticed burn marks on the gambling man's hand, as though he had been scalded. He shared his observation with Myka, who told him to take a break and leave it to her. After much hesitation, Artie finally allowed Claudia to use the device. They directed a beam of light at the mirror, and for the first time, they heard Myka swearing from inside. It was undeniably her, but Artie still refused to believe it. Lena's investigation into the warehouse's old reports revealed no mention of the mirror's origin. However, it was noted that the mirror had once allowed the agents to meet Alice, the inspiration for Alice in Wonderland. The story suggested that an Alice-like figure had emerged from the mirror, slaughtered agents indiscriminately, and had to be resealed inside. Artie explained that's why he won't risk freeing the Myka in the mirror. He believes that's not her, it's Alice using Myka's image to deceive them into letting her out. At the same time, the gambling pair decided to earn a few thousand more before stopping. They both realized that while the chips could bring them winnings, they also came with side effects. The gambling woman said she would handle the rest while he went back to the room and rested. As the woman turned away, the fake Myka suddenly kissed Pete. Of course, Pete didn't resist, but the fake Myka stealthily took the Farnsworth communicator from his pocket, confirming that this Myka was definitely an imposter. After the smelly kiss, Pete stood there, dumbfounded. Fake Myka then told Pete to keep following the gambling woman while she stayed behind to monitor the man. Pete, clueless, happily complied. Back at the warehouse, the team was still debating Myka's situation in the mirror. Lena speculated if the artifacts could interact with one another. Maybe the mirror and the disco ball together caused an unforeseen result. When the ball fell, Myka just so happened to be in front of the magic mirror. Claudia chimed in, saying Myka tilts her head to the right when she's angry. If they make her angry on purpose, they can find out if the person in the mirror is really her. Meanwhile, Pete was observing the gambling woman in the casino and began to understand what was happening. The chips in her hand could foresee events a few minutes into the future, which explained their consistent gambling wins. The warehouse team began implementing their plan, attempting to communicate with the Myka in the mirror again. Myka told Artie something only the two of them would know. She hates him and wants him not to treat her as just a pawn in his game. Even so, she still enjoys working with him because he's capable and smart. She hopes Artie sees her the same way. As she spoke, her head tilted to the right. Artie listened without saying a word, but he placed his hand on the mirror and swore to rescue her. Meanwhile, the fake Myka knocked on the gambling man's door, attempting to seduce him. However, the gambling man immediately saw through her and knocked her out with a single punch. Artie tried contacting Pete through the Farnsworth communicator, but it was intercepted by the fake Myka. Suspicious, Artie asked her ferret's name since it was missing. He suggested they could find it at the warehouse. The fake Myka, caught off guard, couldn't tell him its name but just told him to go ahead and look. She then began preparing to take down the gambling man for no reason other than boredom from being in the mirror for too long. Back at the warehouse, the team confirmed the ferret's name. It was Pete. Pete, oblivious to the situation, tried to reason with the gambling woman, saying she needs to give up these chips. If she keeps using them, her life could be in danger. Reluctantly, the woman handed the chips back to Pete, having already foreseen what would happen 5 minutes later. And just as predicted, the event came to pass. Meanwhile, Artie kept calling Pete, but no one answered. Claudia suggested calling the hotel front desk and using the PA system to summon him. While this was happening, the gambling woman briefly explained the origin of the chips. They had stolen them from someone else. At that moment, the hotel PA announced for Pete to answer the phone. Pete quickly placed the chips into a containment bag and left to take the call. Inside the room, the fake Myka wanted to scare the woman first before torture her. She turned her head, revealing her true face. It's the terrifying Alice from the magic mirror. She pulled out a Tesla gun and shot the gambling woman in the hairy chest. Just as she was enjoying herself, Pete walked in and asked, "What's going on here?" The fake Myka replied the gambling woman tried to assault her sexy body. Pete was skeptical, saying she shouldn't dress like that. It's not entirely her fault. Pete checked the woman's pulse and said, "She's dead like a piece of shit." Hearing this, the woman immediately closed her eyes and pretended to be dead. Pete added he knew she wasn't the real Myka because even if she died, she wouldn't kiss him. Just as Pete was about to cuff the fake Myka, he was startled by the terrifying image of Alice in the mirror, which gave the fake Myka the chance to knock him down and shoot him with the Tesla gun. She then took the chips from Pete's pocket, intending to use them to return to Warehouse 13 and destroy the magic mirror entirely so she could permanently replace Myka in the real world. Standing at the door, she used the chips to foresee her actions and confirmed there was no danger. She entered, picked up a hammer as the vision foretold, and prepared to smash the mirror. But unbeknownst to her, Artie and the others were hiding nearby, watching her every move. As the fake Myka prepared to act, Lena and Claudia positioned a device on the platform, a device Claudia had previously invented to hear Myka's voice in the mirror. They aimed the laser at the mirror as the fake Myka removed the covering. Just as she raised the hammer, they heard the real Myka shout, and a ping-pong ball struck the fake Myka square in the forehead. It turned out Pete had appeared, playing ping-pong. Suddenly, Artie fired a flare, and Claudia shot a yellow laser that hit the Studio 54 disco ball. Accompanied by pulsating music, the fake Myka was sucked into the mirror, including her smelly part. When they retrieved the mirror, the real Myka emerged. She and Pete shared an emotional hug with Artie, who then covered the mirror and said this thing was too dangerous. It needed to go into the dark artifacts section. As Artie explained, the section was where the most powerful artifacts were stored. He then told Pete to hand over the rest of his money. Pete replied, "It's gone." He took a helicopter back. How else could he be so quick? The scene shifts to a man who was wandering aimlessly in a bar when a woman approached him and asked why he killed her. The man froze as memories of a drunken car accident flooded back to him. He realized he had indeed killed the girl standing before him. Clearly, this was a ghost. Everyone in the bar started staring at him, cornering him until he jumped out a window. But it turned out everything was an illusion. He was in prison and had already died from the fall. At Lena's villa, Myka received a package containing documents from the 2008 Denver mission. Her boyfriend had died during that operation. As she hesitated whether to open it, Pete arrived to report the prison suicide. Artie instructed the two of them to begin investigating. Meanwhile, Artie asked Claudia to conduct an inventory of the warehouse's artifacts. While she was cataloging, the lights flickered. To avoid being blinded, she decided to take refuge in the office area. There, she found Artie working on a composition, a song he intended to dedicate to his father. Claudia asked Artie for the keys to the lift and offered to fix the light bulb. She noticed the filament was nearly burnt out, but Artie assured her that's impossible. These bulbs never burn out, they're Shelby bulbs. Artie explained that Shelby bulbs were invented in 1808 by Adolf Scheidt, who co-founded the Shelby Electric Company in the late 19th century. The bulbs were renowned for their durability. He pointed out one of these legendary bulbs in a California fire station, which had been continuously lit since 1901. At this moment, the weather turned, signaling an impending storm. Pete and Myka had just entered the prison to begin their investigation. The warden greeted them and started recounting the recent bizarre events at the facility. Last month, 4 inmates committed suicide, remarkably all of them model prisoners. No one knew why they had taken their own lives, as the prison hadn't seen a death in years. Myka asked if anything was unusual brought into the prison before the first suicide. The warden asked if it counted her. It turned out that the previous warden had recently retired, and the current warden had only been in the position for a few months. She had also recently renovated her office. At that moment, Myka thought she saw her boyfriend, who had passed away. She quickly followed the figure but was unable to find any trace of him. Pete examined the personal belongings of one of the murderers and discovered a book with an Ouroboros symbol on the cover. The Ouroboros, a snake eating its own tail, symbolizes self-reflection and cycles. The book belonged to an inmate named John, who had authored it to describe his path to redemption. John was imprisoned for brutally murdering his wife. He had started reflecting on his actions and even founded a self-redemption group within the prison. Many inmates had joined the group and were walking the path of self-redemption. On the surface, this seemed like a good thing, but Pete felt something was off. Meanwhile, Claudia was still cataloging artifacts at the warehouse when she came across a lab coat belonging to Alexander Volta. The coat had the ability to temporarily enhance the wearer's magnetic field. Curious, she put it on and began climbing the iron racks to fix a light bulb. As she tightened the bulb, the 108-year-old light bulb finally went out. Back at the prison, Pete suddenly stopped in his tracks, his expression turning grim. He claimed to have seen his deceased father. The increasing intensity of the lightning storm only amplified the artifact's powers. Pete and Myka reported the strange hallucinations to Artie, who explained that the storm might be enhancing the artifact's ability. If this artifact can induce hallucinations, the tropical storm will make them even more vivid, so they need to find the artifact quickly. The pair went to see the prison doctor, hoping to learn more about the last inmate to commit suicide. The doctor explained that the man was his most cared-for inmate, and that he had been working to treat the man's psychological issues. Yet, the inmate still took his own life, reportedly screaming the name of the girl he had killed in a drunk driving accident. It was clear he had been experiencing a vivid hallucination. Coincidentally, the inmate had been a member of John's self-redemption group, but later left under mysterious circumstances. Pete wondered if John had punished the inmate for leaving the group, or if the artifact was in John's possession. But the warden vouched for John, claiming his faith-based group was harmless, even though their beliefs seemed peculiar. While searching John, Pete and Myka found a necklace engraved with the Ouroboros symbol. Holding it, they recited phrases about God, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary. While Pete was questioning John, Myka once again saw a vision of her boyfriend. It was so vivid and real that she chased after it, but fortunately Pete snapped her out of it before she was completely drawn in. At the warehouse, Claudia was still working on the light bulb when her electromagnetic field suddenly intensified, causing her to get stuck to the iron rack. Various metal objects, including bicycles, were pulled toward her. Back at the prison, Pete and Myka reviewed old records, which revealed that the prison had experienced multiple uncontrollable riots in its history. However, since the previous warden's tenure, the riots had ceased. Pete speculated if the former warden could have done something to stop them. Just then, the current warden froze in place before snapping out of it, as though she had seen something. She pointed to a photo of the previous warden and said he had removed a statue of an Ouroboros from the prison. Pete and Myka confiscated John's necklace, leaving the warden puzzled. Pete told her she didn't need to know the exact reason, just know the suicides have stopped. However, in the medical room, something terrifying happened. The last inmate, who had died, suddenly came back to life. The doctor was shocked, exclaiming his disbelief before being killed by the resurrected inmate. The next day, the warden summoned Pete and Myka. She angrily said the doctor committed suicide in the infirmary. She told them to get out of here once this storm is over. After the warden left, Pete and Myka continued their investigation. It became clear that the confiscated necklace wasn't the real artifact. Pete found the recorder the doctor had dropped during the incident. When they played it back, it captured the doctor's last words, but also a faint sound of static interference. They reported this to Artie, who deduced it could be caused by vibrations affecting a naturally occurring mineral in the artifact. This led them to suspect that the artifact was composed of or contained natural minerals. Meanwhile, Artie checked in on Claudia, who was still stuck mid-air due to the Volta lab coat's uncontrollable magnetic pull. Artie explained the more metal it attracts, the stronger its pull becomes, as even his glasses were drawn toward her. Myka improvised a metal detector with her walkie-talkie, but it beeped constantly, no matter where she went. Pete thought there couldn't be minerals everywhere. It turned out there could be. Beneath the prison was an old quartz mine, and the quartz was creating magnetic disturbances throughout the prison. The duo pondered how to handle the situation and why the prison was unaffected for a while. Just then, lightning flashed, the lights in the prison flickered, and the two started experiencing hallucinations. Fearing for their safety, they retreated to the warden's office. However, the warden slammed the door shut and yelled for them to get lost. Even the guards seemed to have seen something terrifying and fled the scene. Inside her office, the warden was tormented by hallucinations, while chaos broke out in the prison as numerous inmates began jumping to their deaths. Pete and Myka reported the situation to Artie, who speculated that the quartz's magnetic field had been neutralized by another object for a period of time. If they find that object and place it near the quartz, it might stabilize the frequencies again. However, due to the tropical storm, communication was cut off. Back at the warehouse, Artie continued trying to free Claudia, but his attempts to redirect the lab coat's magnetic pull failed. As the storm intensified, even cars were being drawn toward her. Artie exclaimed if they didn't get her out soon, she would be crushed into mashed potatoes. At the prison, Pete noticed a large crucifix that had once hung in the previous warden's office. Suddenly, an idea struck him. After the new warden took over, the rest of the prison remained the same, but her office was renovated. That crucifix was removed during the renovation. Pete located the crucifix in the warehouse and prepared to bring it back to the prison. However, John and a group of his followers appeared, blocking his path. John said he was here to save the warden. He told him to stand aside and watch him pry open that door. With that, John and his group broke into the office, only for the warden to shoot John down on the spot. As the storm raged on, Pete and Myka once again fell into hallucinations. Pete's vision took him back to the day his father left for his final mission. Although guilt had lingered over not stopping his father, Pete realized it wouldn't have mattered. Even if he had said something, his dad's personality meant he'd still go. His sacrifice was inevitable. Embracing the vision of his father, Pete said he would marry someone beautiful and told him to rest in peace. With that, Pete successfully talked his way out of the hallucination. Returning to Myka, her memory transported her back to the Denver mission. Through her earpiece, she could hear the superior's command to set up an ambush at the foot of the stairs. However, her boyfriend decided to take on the bad guys head-on, convinced his martial arts skills would carry him through. Charging up the stairs without a gun, he was predictably shot dead by the criminals. As his ghost appeared before Myka, it berated her, blaming her for his death, and pressured her to take her own life. As Myka was on the verge of breaking, Pete's voice reached her ears, grounding her. Myka shouted back at her boyfriend's apparition, saying she loved him, but she wasn't wrong. She accused him of not bringing a gun when he got into the chaos. Finally, she told him to rest in peace. With this, Myka broke free from her hallucination. Pete hurriedly placed the crucifix back in its rightful spot as shown in the photo. Balance was restored. Turning to the injured John, the trio found him barely clinging to life. He smiled weakly and told them not to save him since God told him to sacrifice himself, and so he should. With that, he passed away peacefully. At the warehouse, Artie was working like a human antenna, holding a metal arrow in the air to charge it. Once it was fully charged, he fired it at a bicycle, finally neutralizing the Volta lab coat's magnetic pull and rescuing Claudia. Artie ordered her to write her promise on the chalkboard 100 times. Meanwhile, Myka set fire to the Denver mission documents, finally freeing herself of the emotional burden. Artie then instructed Myka and Pete to write detailed reports for submission, not to Mrs. Irene, but to someone even higher in authority. Claudia was tasked with repairing items in the warehouse. In minutes, she had fixed a robotic vacuum cleaner. Feeling thirsty, she treated herself to a soda and even used a snow globe toy to chill her drink. After fixing the robot, she moved on to repairing the chains on the main door, but that's when disaster struck. Numerous artifacts fell off the shelves, including a bottle of something called sticky string. The bottle toppled into the gears of the neutralizer system, jamming and shredding the mechanism. The neutralizer was critical for suppressing the primal energies of the artifacts stored in the warehouse. Without it, the warehouse would be in serious danger. When Myka and Pete returned to the warehouse, they saw multiple disturbance signals on the monitoring screen, definitely a bad sign. Entering the facility, they were shocked to see the chaos. Meanwhile, Artie handed their reports to a courier, only to be startled by the sudden appearance of Irene's bodyguards. Inside the warehouse, the neutralizer system was frozen due to the sticky string, causing the system's alarms to blare. Myka and Pete found Claudia's headband and were wondering where she had gone when a ball suddenly bounced on its own. The ball introduced itself as dodgeball. This wasn't any ordinary ball, it multiplied. From 1, it split into 2, then 3, and each time it launched an attack, the number doubled. Myka and Pete read the artifact plaque, which explained that the dodgeball was initially used for military agility training. However, after it tragically killed 5 cadets in 1972, the ball was archived in Warehouse 13. The deaths had been gruesome. Myka noticed an emergency neutralizer unit in the corner and attempted to grab it. However, the neutralizer system had already shut down, rendering it useless. Pete urged Myka to run, saying when the ball hit her he would catch it and stop it. Myka refused to run and told Pete to run while she would catch it. Pete pointed dramatically, distracting Myka just enough for the ball to attack her. Fortunately, Pete managed to grab the ball at the last second, stopping it in its tracks. Cut to Artie, who was meeting Irene at a restaurant. Although Irene rarely stayed at the warehouse, she seemed to know everything that had happened there, including the recent mishap with the magic mirror. She questioned Artie if his 2 employees are actually competent, or if they are just plain clueless and not able to handle their jobs anymore. Back at the warehouse, Pete and Myka were still searching for Claudia when Pete climbed to a high vantage point and spotted a glowing green house with a massive hole in the roof shaped suspiciously like Claudia. It seems Claudia must have fallen in. When they arrived at the house, Myka realized this was Lena's villa and wondered how this place is here. It appeared that Lena's old villa had somehow turned into an artifact, while the one they were living in now must have been rebuilt later. Without hesitation, they pushed the door open and entered. Suddenly, Claudia came rushing downstairs, shouting for them not to close the door, but it was too late. The door shut behind them. Claudia sighed, knowing that now none of us are getting out. The villa's effect trapped anyone who entered, and Claudia admitted she had already tried every door with no success. Meanwhile, the neutralizer system's reserves were nearing critical levels, and the alarms were blaring chaotically. Pete even tried the windows, but none would open. Even the hole Claudia had fallen through was useless. It only led back to the fireplace. Resigned to their fate, the 3 of them sat on the sofa, staring at each other in disbelief. Back at the restaurant, 2 diners finished their meals and left. A servant gave a discreet signal indicating that the restaurant was now closed. The remaining patrons turned to Artie in unison. These weren't ordinary diners. They were members of the warehouse's board of directors, the financial backers behind its operations. They were powerful individuals with more authority than even Irene. Each board member came from a distinct professional background and was part of a hidden elite group. They only appeared during times of extreme crisis. This meeting was to address 2 issues. First, whether James posed a threat to Warehouse 13, and second, whether Artie was capable of managing the warehouse. Artie defended himself firmly, saying James is absolutely a threat, but he is more than capable and his 2 employees are the best in their fields. However, one board member questioned his claims, citing past incidents such as Pete destroying a church pew and Alice nearly escaping from the mirror. Inside the villa, Myka suddenly realized that this house is exactly the same as the one they're living in. Maybe the key to escaping is to find what's different. Pete pointed to a sofa, saying he didn't remember sitting on this. Claudia retorted by saying that he slept on it like a log just yesterday. Claudia then pointed at a lamp, mentioning that she didn't recognize this. Pete replied, "That's because he changed the bulb yesterday." Myka noticed a painting and asked if this was here before. Pete confirmed, saying their current house doesn't have this painting. Hearing this, Claudia put down the lamp she was examining and joined them. Myka then realized the painting was changing, reflecting the interior of the room. Pete grabbed a pen and drew a door on the painting, and to their surprise, a real door appeared. However, it still wouldn't let them out. Frustrated, Pete threw the pen at the painting, creating a small tear. Myka used her knife to enlarge the tear, revealing a massive opening in the wall. Finally, the trio escaped. Back at the warehouse, a storm cloud had formed in one corner due to electromagnetic disturbances. The neutralizer system's reserves were critically low, and the alarms were signaling imminent failure. Claudia explained the neutralizer system spreads a purple mist throughout the warehouse to maintain a stable suppression field. If the field collapses, Warehouse 13 will be destroyed, and if things get really bad, Earth might not survive. Claudia identified the shortest route to the destination. Pete said the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line, but if it means cutting through the dark artifacts zone, they're in for some fun. Pete was thrilled and declared it a tour opportunity. Claudia easily unlocked the gate to the dark zone. As they entered, all three were on edge. The artifacts here were extraordinarily dangerous, requiring a custom containment system with continuous ultraviolet rays. Pete noticed a doll, which flashed a creepy smile at him, sending him stumbling backward. Next, Pete found a typewriter. Meanwhile, Myka and Claudia had managed to unlock the exit, but as soon as they stepped out, Myka realized something was wrong. Pete hadn't followed. The door had shut, trapping him inside with the typewriter. Back at the warehouse, the energy levels were dangerously approaching 90%. If it reached 100%, the entire world would be doomed. Over the intercom, pre-recorded instructions from Irene urged agents to evacuate immediately. Claudia frantically worked on opening the door, but nothing worked. Frustrated, Myka kicked it open. Inside, Pete stood transfixed, muttering poetic nonsense to the typewriter. Myka identified it as Sylvia Plath's typewriter, infamous because the American poet had used it before her tragic suicide. Realizing the typewriter was draining Pete's life force, Myka told Claudia to proceed with repairing the containment system while she stayed behind to save Pete. Elsewhere, Artie was enduring intense questioning from the board members. Frustrated, he stood up and told them to stop the nonsense. James is wreaking havoc outside, and instead of dealing with him, they're here wasting time on him. After Artie stormed out, Irene turned to the board, telling them to decide either to support him or step aside. Back at the warehouse, Pete was visibly aging, his hair turning white, and he looked utterly drained. Myka, wielding a broom, managed to push him out of the typewriter's zone of influence. Pete immediately recovered and exclaimed that it was Aztec bloodstone. Meanwhile, Claudia reached the containment system and began pulling at the sticky threads clogging the gears. Myka joined her, but found Claudia had foolishly discarded her protective gloves and was now stuck. Myka tried to help barehanded, getting herself stuck as well. Fortunately, Pete arrived just in time, but when he attempted to assist, both women shouted at him to stop. Instead, they instructed him to check Claudia's tool bag. Inside, Pete found a snow globe. With just 30 seconds left on the countdown, Pete froze the sticky threads using the snow globe and then smashed them with a hammer, successfully fixing the containment system. Everyone was safe, and Irene announced that the board had decided to keep Artie as the warehouse manager and tasked him with hunting down James. When Artie returned to the warehouse, he found the team had restored everything to normal. Pete confidently told them not to worry since Artie won't notice a thing. Naturally, Artie overheard and demanded an explanation. The team confessed to everything, from the dodgeball incident to the events at Myka's villa and the Dark Zone tour. Surprisingly, Artie praised them, saying he once had only 17 seconds left to repair the containment system. Irene's countdown could drive anyone crazy, but they handled it better than he ever did. The trio, relieved, realized they weren't going to get scolded after all. After the high-stakes repairs, the team decided to step out for food. Watching them leave, Artie told them to rest up, because the next battle is just around the corner. Earlier, we mentioned that Myka's father runs a bookstore aptly named Myka and Sons. One day, someone left a package at the store's entrance and quickly walked away. The sender was an old man who happens to be Myka's father. Curious, Myka's father opened the package and discovered a handwritten book, which he began reading with great interest. Cut to another scene, Myka and Pete were searching for James. The two had split up, each headed to a different destination. Myka raided James's old apartment in Berlin, but unfortunately her search came up empty. Meanwhile, Pete was in Canada, had better luck. He spotted James and cornered him in a dead-end alley. However, James remained unfazed, casually lifting his hand to reveal two tiny symbols on his fingers. Pete immediately covered his ears, but it was too late. The sound was so powerful it knocked Pete unconscious, though he survived the attack. James managed to escape once again. Meanwhile, Myka's father was still engrossed in the handwritten book when, without warning, the letters on the page started crawling up his arm and onto his face. Letting out a blood-curdling scream, he collapsed unconscious. Not long after, Myka received a call from her mom, who sounded frantic. She urged her to hurry home since something's wrong with her dad. Myka requested leave from Artie and rushed home as fast as she could. Meanwhile, the scene shifted to Portland, where a lanky student tripped over someone's foot and fell face first. This student was carrying a photo of a girl, and it was clear from the way he looked at it that she was someone special to him. Unfortunately, his bully, an unapologetic jerk, snatched the photo, tore it up, and sneered that he's acting like a swan dreaming of a toad. Although the lanky student was furious, he knew he wasn't strong enough to fight back, so he quietly picked up the torn pieces of the photo. At Lena's villa, Irene met with Artie to discuss the ongoing mission to capture James. She wanted to understand what had gone wrong during the last attempt, particularly since James had used the symbols to kill 2 police officers. Artie explained that the symbols were merely a diversion, James's way of creating chaos and slipping away unnoticed. Irene warned him to be more cautious moving forward and not to act impulsively. They need a proper plan before taking action. Otherwise, if anything happens, she swears on the ashes of Warehouse 12, she will confiscate everything. Her words hinted that there had been another Warehouse 12 in the past, one that ended tragically in flames. Back at the school, the lanky student was held back after class by his teacher, who was concerned about his lack of focus. He explained that he had been overwhelmed with writing assignments lately. The teacher asked him if he had confessed to his crush yet. The lanky student chuckled and brushed off the comment. It turned out his crush was the girl in the photo. She was sweet and good-looking, and the lanky student clearly liked her and wanted to crush his hormones on her. The teacher smiled and handed him a poetry book, saying maybe this will help ease his heartache. Afterward, the lanky student heard a strange voice calling to him. Turning around, he saw only his crush, but she hadn't said anything. It seemed the voice was coming from a glass display case nearby. Inside the case was a pen with a mysterious, almost magnetic pull that seemed to captivate the lanky student. Meanwhile, Myka raced back to her family's bookstore, only to find her mother waiting there, looking calm. Her mom reassured her that her father was fine now. When the father saw his daughter, he muttered coldly what she was doing here. The tension between father and daughter was palpable. The mother tried to comfort her, suggesting that her father's strange behavior might have been due to a stroke, but for reasons unknown, Myka's father had let out a terrifying, blood-curdling scream before collapsing. When he woke up, he found himself inside an ambulance with no memory of what had happened. While speaking, Pete suddenly showed up, not because he'd just arrived, but because he'd been there all along, having already enjoyed a full meal. It turns out Pete guessed this had to do with an artifact, so he decided to come over first. For now, it didn't seem like a big deal. After all, there weren't any current missions. Pete suggested that Myka use the opportunity to mend her relationship with her father. Meanwhile, Myka's father had gone down to the basement to continue reading the handwritten book. At the school, the lanky student managed to reassemble his crush's photo. As he pieced it together, it was as though he'd become possessed. He wandered blankly into the classroom, then smashed open the glass display case with a punch and took the pen. Back at the bookstore, the words from Myka's father's book once again crawled up his arm. His expression twisted with fear, and he let out a blood-curdling scream that echoed throughout the house. Myka and Pete rushed over to find the father's arm covered in swirling text. Pete grabbed a purple glove and flung the book aside. Of course, the book turned out to be an artifact. It seems that even the family of warehouse agents couldn't escape the reach of artifacts. Shortly after, Claudia arrived with a neutralizing barrel. Myka's mother, confused, asked if they should call 911. Pete ignored her, tossing the handwritten book into the neutralizing barrel. However, nothing happened. The ink from the book merely mixed into the neutralizing liquid, and Myka's father didn't return to normal. His body was still crawling with text. The group quickly reported the situation to Artie, who speculated that this might be a twin artifact, meaning the book was part of a set of 2 or more interconnected artifacts that relied on each other to function. If one were missing, neither would work. Artie suggested that the other artifact was likely the pen or ink. To figure it out, he began investigating the origin of the handwritten book. However, the shipping address turned out to be fake. Clearly, this was another deliberate move by James. As for his purpose, Artie figured it was a diversion to pull the agents away from the warehouse. He's trying to isolate them and hit the warehouse. Analyzing the contents of the manuscript, Artie determined it was written by Edgar Allan Poe, the famous author of mystery and horror stories for Daniel C.C. Movie Channel. This explained why Myka's father had screamed. It was out of terror. The manuscript was draining his life force as it tried to reconnect with Poe's pen. Artie stressed the urgency of finding the pen, so he began searching for reports of nearby paranormal activity that might hint at the pen's location. At the school, the lanky student spotted his crush chatting and laughing with the bully. Furious, he followed the bully to the locker room. When the bully opened a locker, he suddenly shouted the word "fire" before the locker exploded. Simultaneously, Myka's father screamed the same word. The culprit was none other than the lanky student. Artie quickly figured out what had happened. Pete shared the findings with Myka, explaining that her father's scream coincided with an explosion at a school in Portland. Pete suggested that Myka stay with her father while he and Claudia investigated the school. As Myka was touched by Pete's gesture, he confessed that he got a thing for her mom. Meanwhile, the teacher confronted the lanky student. Suspecting he had stolen the pen, the teacher avoided accusing him directly. Instead, he said he was going to the lounge for a drink. He hoped the pen mysteriously returns while he's gone. The lanky student stopped the teacher, handed him a piece of paper, and walked away. Written on the paper was the word wall. Suddenly, the wall opened up and the teacher was sucked inside, vanishing without a trace of his teaching smell. Around the same time, Pete and Claudia arrived at the school. The principal escorted them to the locker that had exploded. Inside, they found nothing unusual except a piece of paper with the word fire written on it. That explained why the bully had shouted the word, but it also suggested the events were tied to a story by Poe. Pete and Claudia asked the principal if the school had any items that once belonged to Poe. The principal mentioned that Poe's pen had recently been stolen. While Myka was taking care of her father, her dad finally revealed why he never really cared for her. It was because he had always hoped for a son. Back when Myka's mom was pregnant, her dad had already chosen a boy's name. When Myka turned out to be a girl, he was disappointed. Myka apologized, but her dad apologized to her, admitting he wasn't a good father. Father and daughter reconciled, but as soon as he said those words, her dad fell unconscious again. Myka's mom asked her if she knew her father once wrote a novel. He revised it 12 times but never published it. Eventually, he gave up and asked her to burn the manuscript. Since then, he's never picked up a pen. At the same time, Pete and Claudia arrived at the classroom where the pen was stolen. Pete heard someone calling for help from within the walls and suddenly remembered that this was a scenario from an Edgar Allan Poe story. Together, they pried open the wall and found the teacher inside, almost suffocated. The teacher revealed that it was the lanky student's doing and begged them to stop him. Meanwhile, the lanky student found his crush and handed her a note with a love poem he claimed to have written. He then forced her to read it aloud. Written on the note was the word mine. Back at the bookstore, Myka's father's condition worsened as the text began spreading across his body. Seeing him on the verge of collapse, Myka asked her mom to find her dad's favorite book so she could read it to him to stabilize him. At the school, Pete and Claudia discovered the lanky student and his crush, with the student clutching Poe's pen. The girl, clearly distressed, also read from a note, while the student pointed to a piece of paper on the ground and told Pete to look at it. Pete read the pendulum word aloud. Suddenly, a giant pendulum materialized above them. Both Pete and Claudia ducked to avoid it, only to find ropes ensnaring them. At the bookstore, Myka's mom found her husband's old manuscript, which she had secretly kept instead of burning. As Myka read it aloud, her father began to react emotionally, silently combating Poe's words with his own. Gradually, parts of the text returned to Poe's manuscript. At the same time, the lanky student's grip on the pen loosened and he dropped it. The ropes around Claudia disappeared, and Pete instructed her to contain the pen. She placed it into a secure containment bag. Though the lanky student and his crush returned to normal, Pete knew this was only one part of the problem. He rushed back to the bookstore with the pen and placed it on top of the manuscript. With the pen and manuscript reunited, the text on Myka's father's body was completely reabsorbed, and he regained his sanity. Father and daughter reconciled fully, and the pen and manuscript were sealed together in a containment bag, marking the end of this case. Suddenly, Claudia appeared at the warehouse with news of James's whereabouts. Coincidentally, it was the same location where Myka and Pete were. Just as Myka received a call, the signal abruptly cut off. The two looked up and saw strange lights coming from the bookstore window. Rushing back, they found James holding a lantern and using it to incapacitate Myka's parents. Seeing the two arrive, James showed no fear and said if this lantern goes out, her parents' life force will extinguish with it. James had come for Poe's pen and manuscript. For her parents' sake, Myka had no choice but to hand them over. In the blink of an eye, James disappeared. The lantern he carried turned out to be the lantern of Jack the Ripper, an artifact that had always been stored in Warehouse 13. But how did it end up here? Regardless of the answer, it became clear that James was playing them like pawns. It was time to stop dancing to his tune. Let's dive into the story of the grudge between Artie and James. 15 years ago, a house was engulfed in flames. James was determined to rush in and save Agent Carol, a colleague Artie had met during one of his missions. From James's words, it was clear that both men had fallen for her sexy body. James challenged Artie to save her, but Artie questioned the consequences, arguing that saving her might cost innocent lives. In a fit of anger, James knocked Artie out, snatched a badge from him, and charged into the inferno to rescue Carol. That night, everyone in the building, including 5 firefighters, perished in the blaze, everyone except Carol. Because of that, James was sentenced to life imprisonment and expelled from Warehouse 13. 2 years into his sentence, a mysterious explosion rocked the prison, killing multiple people, including James, or so it seemed. It was later revealed that he faked his death and escaped, marking the beginning of his feud with Warehouse 13. James believed the sacrifice of so many to save Carol he loved was justified. Others vehemently disagreed. Upon learning of his escape, Irene assigned someone to monitor Carol, who was living in Washington, D.C. However, James never contacted her. Meanwhile, Claudia raised concerns in the warehouse. With James's collection of artifacts, what if he attacked them? Artie dismissed the idea, explaining that the warehouse's foundational structures were made from a rare alloy, and expelled agents were permanently injected with a substance that reacts violently with the alloy. Should James step even a foot into the warehouse, his blood would turn to acid, dissolving his entire vascular system. Artie asked Claudia about her investigation progress. She confidently told her not to worry since her hacking skills were unmatched across the globe. Artie complimented her, hinting that James's computer skills were equally formidable. Soon, Claudia uncovered something significant. Poe's pen and manuscripts were being auctioned online, revealing that James had been collecting artifacts and selling them to the underworld for high prices. That same day, he sold a goblet to a bald man. The goblet had the ability to emit a sound that caused dizziness when its rim was rubbed. After the sale, James revealed his trump card, a badge with a phoenix emblem, stolen 15 years earlier and known as the Phoenix Crest. He handed it to one of the bald man's subordinates and pushed him into a blazing furnace. Miraculously, the man emerged unharmed, but a lackey behind the bald man suddenly collapsed, black smoke billowing from his mouth. This was the Phoenix Crest's dark power. It could save one life by taking another. The bearer of the crest could survive explosions or infernos unscathed, but someone nearby would die in their place. This was how James saved Carol all those years ago. In the wrong hands, like those of a terrorist, the Phoenix Crest could enable endless suicide attacks without the perpetrator suffering harm. In the warehouse, Irene instructed the others to question Carol again, while he stayed behind to interrogate Claudia more thoroughly, blaming her recklessness for nearly destroying the warehouse twice. The team found Carol in Washington, where she insisted James hadn't contacted her. But her lies were quickly exposed by Myka, who found a jewelry box in the trash and 2 umbrellas inside her home. Since her rescue 15 years ago, Carol had become reclusive with no visitors. Yet recently someone had visited her, leaving gifts. Who else could it be but James? Under pressure, Carol admitted he had indeed visited a few times, the last time being 3 days ago. Myka also discovered a business card with JM for James and an emblem resembling an Egyptian scepter. In Egyptian mythology, scepters symbolize divine authority and the power to bring order to chaos. James saw himself as a god, intending to cleanse the world. The necklace Carol wore bore the same emblem, a gift from James. By wearing it, she showed that she still cared for him. Suddenly, Pete pulled Myka's heavy body aside, saying he had a bad feeling about Artie. Before he could explain further, Artie showed up, prompting Pete to change the subject quickly. Artie mentioned that the back of the business card had an address for a factory. Back in the warehouse, Claudia and Lena were attempting to hack into James's auction system. During this, they accidentally stumbled upon a photo of James. Claudia recognized him immediately, exclaiming she knew him. It turned out that James had once been her brother's physics professor and had even given her brother the Reticus compass. 8 months ago, James had also contacted Claudia, teaching her many techniques to bypass firewalls. So in truth, Claudia's ability to hack into the warehouse systems was due to James's covert guidance. Following the address, the trio arrived at the factory. There, they encountered the bald man from earlier. He nonchalantly invited them to search the premises, but secretly began rubbing the rim of the goblet. Despite the dizziness, Pete managed to charge forward and smash the goblet to the ground. The bald man used the opportunity to flee with his bald head. Although the trio was unharmed, they were temporarily unable to hear each other. Artie took a tuning fork from his toolkit, instructed the others to close their eyes, and struck it near their heads. The sound restored their hearing. Looking at the shattered remains on the ground, Artie remarked that this is Severus's goblet. Severus, from the Roman Empire, had the goblet specially crafted for Emperor Elagabalus. The emperor, a notorious tyrant, used the goblet to control his court and quell uprisings. Artie added that this artifact should be in Warehouse 13, so how did it get out? He believed a duplicate shouldn't be possible. Suddenly, Myka discovered a wooden puzzle box on the table, marked with the same scepter emblem. Artie took it, noticing what appeared to be a keyhole on one side. He inserted the bottom of the necklace Carol had worn and unlocked the box, revealing a pair of glasses. He realized these were Cyril's reading glasses, saying they were replicas though. But even replicas should still be in the warehouse. When Artie put them on, he saw the Phoenix crest listed in an auction. The lower left corner displayed the starting bid, $20 million. The glasses seemed to function as a secret communication tool. Stunned, Artie thought it was impossible for him to sell the Phoenix crest since it should still be in the warehouse and there can't be two of them in the world. Myka noticed another discovery. The rim of the box listed the date and location of an upcoming auction, coincidentally happening that very day. She wondered aloud if it could really just be a coincidence. For safety, Artie sent Irene to verify if the Phoenix crest was still in the warehouse. When Irene checked, the Phoenix crest had vanished. In its place was a note saying James was here. Severus's goblet had also been replaced with a baby bottle. Artie still thought it was impossible. The entry logs revealed that the person who had taken the artifacts was none other than Claudia. It seemed she had been James's mole all along. Meanwhile, following the address from the puzzle box, the trio arrived at a desolate wasteland. There was nothing in sight. As they searched, a young boy passed by on a bike. The trio noticed the soil nearby appeared to be a different color. Artie once again put on the replica Cyril's glasses and saw strange patterns. Cyril had experimented with numerous methods to explore the potential of the mind beyond its natural capacity, advocating for the use of lysergic acid as a treatment for mental illness. Lysergic acid, however, is also a well-known hallucinogen. When Myka wore the glasses, she was astonished to see a large rectangular pit in the ground. She quickly urged Artie to retrieve the puzzle box. After the trio descended, Pete's bad feeling returned. Artie brushed it off, saying this all feels exactly like one of James's traps. If James wanted to kill him, he would have died countless times already. He decided to split up with the others to explore. Pete and Myka took a different path and stumbled upon a group of gangsters holding a meeting. Suddenly, Artie appeared, seemingly familiar with the gangsters, holding the Phoenix crest and putting it up for auction. The two were utterly baffled, wondering if Artie had subdued James and was now pretending to be the seller to gather intelligence. Then, another Artie appeared behind them, claiming to be the real one. One of the auctioned items was Harriet Tubman's thimble. Upon hearing this, Myka immediately believed the second Artie. Harriet Tubman, a remarkable abolitionist, had helped countless slaves escape. As a runaway slave herself, the thimble she used to mend clothes gained the mystical ability to alter its shape, a trait developed from the need to evade slave catchers during her escapes. Back in the warehouse, Claudia was shocked to discover that she had taken the artifact. She wondered how she could do something so vile since she considered this place her home. Irene reassured her, saying it's very possible she wasn't acting of her own will, and there are many ways to create sleeper agents. Stunned, Claudia asked if she had been brainwashed. To prevent further harm, she decided to leave the warehouse. Meanwhile, at the auction, a Korean buyer successfully purchased the Phoenix crest. Pete and Myka tried to apprehend the fake Artie, but James suddenly appeared behind the real Artie, holding a knife to his chicken throat and a sphere in his hand. At the same time, the fake Artie continued orchestrating the auction, with Poe's pen and manuscript as the next lot. Suddenly, alarms blared, causing the buyers to scatter in panic. Pete and Myka subdued the fake Artie, assuming it was James in disguise. They handcuffed him only for the real James to emerge from behind. After removing a thimble from the fake Artie's finger, they discovered it was just a lackey. James then dragged Artie out of the shadows. Artie, with the sphere in his mouth, revealed it to be an eggshell bomb, a small but deadly device that James had once commissioned while working on implosive weapons. The bomb, though small, could detonate with the force of a nuclear explosion from even the slightest pressure. James taunted him to bite down and let them all go down together, but Artie didn't. Instead, James began attempting to recruit Pete to his cause. Pete, ever cheeky, asked if he had any pretty women in his gang. They're the only thing that could make him stay. Seeing Pete's unserious demeanor, James dismissed him with a wave. Pete, however, stopped him, holding up shards of the goblet and smashing them to the ground. The sound waves disoriented James, allowing Myka to safely recover the eggshell bomb. With James stunned, the team successfully captured him. Artie remarked that James is no ordinary criminal. The warehouse is the only place that can hold him. Pete and Myka were puzzled, saying James was unable to even enter the warehouse, though. James explained to the confused Pete that there was an area in the warehouse known as the Statue Zone. As the name implied, it housed statues that were once highly dangerous individuals who had been immobilized and imprisoned there. At the warehouse gates, Irene handed James the necklace from her neck. The diamond on the necklace was a crystallized essence of a guardian deity capable of neutralizing the minerals in James's blood. Irene bid her farewell before walking away with her bodyguards. In the Statue Zone, Artie explained, if these individuals were to return to the world, it would undoubtedly lead to its destruction. Imagine fugitives more dangerous than even Hitler. He described the process of creating the statues, rapid freezing followed by copper plating. Myka asked if they were so dangerous, why not just kill them outright? Without a word, Artie froze James and transformed him into a statue. It seemed like everything was resolved, but Pete suddenly had another ominous feeling. Cut to another scene. Someone placed James's statue into the freezing chamber and activated reverse cooling, releasing James. Just like that, James regained his freedom and successfully infiltrated the warehouse. It turned out the entire sequence had been orchestrated by James. The person who released him was none other than Claudia, who even waved at the surveillance camera before leaving with him. Suddenly, Irene seemed to realize something critical and ordered her bodyguards to turn around immediately. Meanwhile, James instructed Claudia to remove her thimble. In a shocking twist, it was revealed that the warehouse employee, Lena, was the true traitor all along. At that moment, Artie was taking inventory of artifacts in the warehouse when an alarm blared. He rushed to investigate and found James working on a computer. Even using a Tesla gun against him was ineffective. Suddenly, copper walls shot up all around Warehouse 13, sealing off the area. James knocked Artie unconscious and made his escape. Pete and Myka arrived at the scene but were unable to enter because of the sealed gates. Taking advantage of the chaos, James slipped away with his smelly butt. As Artie regained consciousness, he quickly gave chase, but James managed to activate the warehouse's self-destruct system before escaping. In the end, Artie sacrificed himself, and Warehouse 13 suffered a massive explosion, leaving a gaping hole in its structure. With that, Season 1 of this drama concludes. This is Daniel CC Movie Channel. Stay safe and enjoy your day.